smell hit me first, that unmistakable aroma of butter and fresh seafood that makes your mouth water even when you don't want it to. I stood in the doorway of my son's beach house, my hand still on the brass knob, watching the scene unfold before me like some kind of twisted Norman Rockwell painting. There they were, gathered around that expensive mahogany table I'd helped Marcus buy when he first made partner at the firm. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, catching the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Atlantic. And on fine china plates that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check sat enormous Maine lobsters, their red shells cracked open to reveal the tender white meat inside. Marcus, his wife Victoria, her parents, the Wellingtons, with their starched collars and pursed lips. Even Victoria's sister Clarissa, who I'd only met twice before and who'd spent both occasions looking at me like I was something she'd scraped off her Laubautins. And then there was Sophie, my granddaughter, 7 years old with her mother's dark curls and, thank God, my late wife's kind eyes. She sat at the far end of the table, almost pushed into the corner, with a paper plate in front of her, not china, paper. On that plate sat 2 slices of bread. I could see from across the room that they were stale, the edges curled up and slightly hardened. "Grandpa," Sophie's face lit up when she saw me, and she started to rise from her chair. "Sophie, sit down," Victoria said sharply, not even looking at her daughter. She was busy extracting meat from a lobster claw with one of those tiny forks that serve no purpose except to make you feel fancy. "We're not finished with dinner." I felt my jaw tighten. I'm 73 years old, and I've learned to pick my battles, but seeing my granddaughter's face fall back into that resigned sadness that no child should ever wear, that made something in my chest crack open. "William," Marcus finally noticed me, wiping his mouth with a cloth napkin. "I thought you weren't arriving until tomorrow." "Flight got changed," I said, stepping fully into the room. My old duffel bag hung from my shoulder, the same one I'd carried through Vietnam 50 years ago. Tried calling, but nobody answered. "We've been entertaining," Victoria said, as if that explained everything. As if that explained why my granddaughter was eating stale bread while they feasted on lobster. I walked further into the room, my footsteps loud on the hardwood floor. The Wellingtons watched me with that particular brand of polite disdain that wealthy people reserve for those they consider beneath them. I'd grown up poor in South Boston, worked construction for 40 years, and retired with just enough to live comfortably in my small apartment. I wasn't ashamed of it, but I knew exactly what people like them saw when they looked at me. "Sophie," I said, ignoring everyone else, "why don't you come give your old grandpa a hug?" She looked at her mother, seeking permission. That alone made my blood boil. Since when did a child need permission to hug her grandfather? Victoria waved her hand dismissively, already turning back to her conversation with Clarissa about some charity auction. Sophie scrambled out of her chair and ran to me. I dropped my bag and caught her in my arms, feeling how thin she'd gotten since I'd last seen her 3 months ago. She buried her face in my shoulder, and I felt her small body trembling. "Hey, sweetheart," I whispered into her hair, "what's going on here?" "I'm not hungry anyway," she whispered back, but I felt her stomach growl against mine. I pulled back and looked at her face, really looked at it. There were shadows under her eyes, her cheeks seemed hollow, and there was something else, a haunted quality that no 7-year-old should possess. "Marcus," I said, straightening up but keeping my hand on Sophie's shoulder, "can I talk to you in the kitchen?" "We're in the middle of dinner, Dad." "Now, Marcus." Something in my tone must have gotten through because he actually put down his fork and stood up, though not without an apologetic glance at the Wellingtons, as if he needed to apologize for his father's existence. I guided Sophie back to her chair first. "You sit tight, sweetheart, Grandpa's going to fix this." In the kitchen, Marcus closed the door and immediately went on the defensive. "Before you start, why is my granddaughter eating stale bread while you're all having lobster?" He had the decency to look uncomfortable, running his hand through his hair the way he used to when he was a boy and knew he was in trouble. "It's complicated, Dad." "Uncomplicated." Marcus sighed and leaned against the marble countertop. The kitchen was all gleaming surfaces and expensive appliances, the kind of kitchen that made a statement about success. Sophie, she's been having some issues with food. Victoria's been working with a nutritionist, and they think stale bread is the solution. She's been difficult lately, refusing to eat what we make, throwing tantrums. The nutritionist suggested removing problem foods and offering only simple, plain options until she learns to appreciate what she's given. I stared at my son, this man I'd raised, and wondered where I'd gone wrong. She's 7 years old, Marcus. She's a child, and she looks half-starved. You don't understand. You're not here every day. She's manipulative, Dad. She plays games with food, tries to get attention. Or maybe she's hungry, and you're all too busy stuffing your faces with lobster to notice. Marcus's face flushed red. That's not fair. We've been dealing with this for months. Victoria's mother recommended this approach. Mrs. Wellington raised 4 successful children, and she says, Mrs. Wellington, I interrupted, is currently out there eating lobster while her granddaughter eats bread that's probably been sitting in your pantry for a week. So forgive me if I don't give a damn about her parenting advice. Dad, please, you're being dramatic. Sophie is fine. She's just going through a phase. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw someone I barely recognized. When had he become this person? When had he started caring more about impressing his in-laws than about his own daughter's well-being? I'm taking Sophie out for dinner, I said flatly. The hell you are. We're in the middle of. You're in the middle of a lobster dinner. She's in the middle of starving. I'm her grandfather, and I'm taking her out for a proper meal. You can either allow it, or I can call Child Protective Services and let them sort this out. Marcus's eyes widened. You wouldn't. Try me. We stared at each other for a long moment. I watched the calculations happening behind his eyes, weighing his wife's anger against the threat I'd just made, against whatever remained of his conscience. Fine, he finally said. But she needs to be back by 8. And Dad, don't undermine what we're trying to do here. Don't make us the bad guys to her. I didn't trust myself to respond to that without saying something I'd regret, so I just turned and walked back into the dining room. Sophie, I said, holding out my hand, how about you and Grandpa go on an adventure? Her eyes lit up in a way that broke my heart. Really? Really, go get your jacket. She didn't need to be told twice. She jumped up from her chair and ran toward the stairs. Where are you taking her? Victoria asked, finally deigning to acknowledge my presence with actual eye contact. Out for dinner, real dinner. She's already eaten, Victoria said coolly. I picked up the paper plate with the stale bread and held it up. This isn't dinner. This is what you'd feed pigeons in the park, and even then you'd feel bad about the quality. Mrs. Wellington gasped. Mr. Wellington's face turned an interesting shade of purple. Clarissa actually smiled, which surprised me. How dare you, Victoria began, but Marcus cut her off. It's fine, Dad's taking her out, it's fine. Sophie came thundering back down the stairs, her little jacket on and buttoned wrong, her face flushed with excitement. I took her hand and headed for the door, feeling 6 pairs of eyes burning into my back. See you at 8, I called over my shoulder. The moment we stepped outside, Sophie took a deep breath, as if she'd been holding it inside the house. The late afternoon sun was warm on our faces, and the smell of the ocean replaced the claustrophobic atmosphere of that dining room. Where are we going, Grandpa? Sophie asked, practically skipping beside me. Well, I said, I passed a diner about 2 miles back that looked pretty good. They had a sign in the window advertising the best pancakes on the coast. What do you say we go check it out? Pancakes for dinner. Her eyes widened like I'd suggested something scandalous and wonderful. Why not? Life's too short to follow all the rules all the time. We walked to my rental car, and I helped her into the back seat, making sure her seatbelt was secure. As I drove toward the diner, I kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window, her small face thoughtful. Grandpa, she said after a while. Yeah, sweetheart. Am I bad? The question hit me like a physical blow. I pulled into the diner's parking lot and turned off the engine before turning around to face her. Sophie, look at me. You are not bad. You are good and kind and smart and wonderful. Do you understand me? Her lower lip trembled. Mommy says I'm difficult, that I don't appreciate things, that I need to learn to be grateful. I unbuckled my seatbelt and got out, opening her door and crouching down so we were eye to eye. Sophie, being hungry isn't being difficult. Wanting to eat the same food as everyone else isn't being ungrateful. You're a little girl, and you deserve to be treated like one. But Grandma Wellington says, I don't care what Grandma Wellington says. You're my granddaughter, and I love you more than anything in this world. And right now, we're going to go in there, and you're going to order whatever you want, and we're going to have a nice dinner together. Okay. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and took my hand. The diner was everything a proper diner should be: worn vinyl booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and the smell of coffee and home cooking. A waitress with kind eyes and a name tag that read Betty showed us to a booth by the window. What can I get you folks? She asked, pulling out her order pad. I'll have coffee and the turkey club, I said, and this young lady will have. I looked at Sophie encouragingly. Can I really have pancakes? She whispered. You can have anything you want, honey, Betty said with a warm smile. Chocolate chip pancakes, please, with whipped cream and bacon and orange juice. Coming right up. As Betty walked away, Sophie looked at me with tears in her eyes again. I haven't had chocolate chip pancakes in so long. How long, sweetheart? Since before Grandma and Grandpa Wellington moved nearby. That was, I think it was after my birthday. They said pancakes were too much sugar, and sugar makes kids hyper and bad. 6 months. For 6 months, my granddaughter had been living under the Wellingtons' twisted idea of proper child-rearing, and my son had just gone along with it. But that wasn't the whole story, was it? There was something else going on here, something deeper than just bad parenting decisions. Sophie, I said gently, can you tell me what's been happening at home? The truth. And so, as the sun set over the ocean and Betty brought us our food, Sophie told me everything. The truth was both better and worse than I'd imagined. Victoria wasn't trying to starve Sophie, she genuinely believed she was helping. The Wellingtons had convinced her that Sophie was developing unhealthy food relationships and that strict control now would save her from eating disorders later. They'd hired a nutritionist who, I would later discover, specialized in an extreme approach that most legitimate professionals considered harmful. But here's what they didn't know, what Sophie had been too scared to tell anyone. She was being bullied at her new private school. The Wellington children had all attended Ashford Academy, and they'd pulled strings to get Sophie in. The other kids, they came from old money, and they'd latched onto Sophie's middle-class grandparents, me, as a source of mockery. They call you the construction worker, Sophie told me, her voice small. They said Daddy married up and that Mommy must be embarrassed by you. The food helped. With every bite of pancake, with every strip of bacon, Sophie seemed to gain strength. And as she gained strength, the whole story came tumbling out. She'd lost her appetite because of anxiety. The nutritionist had labeled her picky and manipulative without ever considering that she might be stressed. Victoria, desperate to prove to her parents that she was a good mother, had followed every recommendation without question. And Marcus, my son, had been too focused on making partner, on keeping his in-laws happy, on maintaining his new lifestyle, to notice his daughter was drowning. The worst part, Sophie said, is that I love Mommy and Daddy. I don't want to make them angry, but I'm so hungry all the time, Grandpa, and I'm so tired. I reached across the table and took her small hand in mine. You're not going to be hungry anymore, I promise you that. When we returned to the beach house at exactly 8 o'clock, the dinner party was over. Marcus was waiting in the living room, alone. We need to talk, I said. Dad, I know what you're going to say. No, you don't. because if you knew, you would have done something about it already. I told him everything Sophie had told me. I watched his face change as he realized the scope of what had been happening. To his credit, the color drained from his face and his hands started shaking. I didn't know, he whispered, about the bullying, about how bad she was feeling. You didn't ask. You were too busy trying to impress people who think your daughter should eat stale bread while they eat lobster. Marcus looked at Sophie, who was standing close to me, her hand in mine. Sophie, baby, I'm so sorry. It's okay, Daddy. No, he said, his voice cracking. It's not okay. Nothing about this is okay. What happened next took time. Marcus and Victoria entered family therapy. They switched Sophie to a new school. They distanced themselves from the Wellingtons' advice. Though not from the Wellingtons entirely, Victoria loved her parents, even if their methods were flawed. The nutritionist was fired, and Sophie began seeing a child psychologist who actually listened to her. But the real change happened that night, after our conversation, when Marcus went upstairs and came back down with a plate. On it was lobster, real lobster, with butter and lemon, and a generous portion of the salad that had been served at dinner. He put it in front of Sophie and sat down beside her. I'm sorry I forgot what's important, he said, and I'm sorry I let anyone make you feel small. You're my daughter, and you're perfect exactly as you are. Sophie looked at the lobster, then at her father, then at me, and then she did something that made my heart swell with pride. Can I have a turkey sandwich instead? She asked. I'm kind of full from the pancakes. Marcus laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. Yeah, baby, you can have whatever you want. As I watched my son make his daughter a turkey sandwich, as I saw them sit together at that expensive table, talking and laughing, I thought about how close we'd come to losing something precious. How easy it is to get caught up in appearances and expectations, to forget that the simplest things, a child's laughter, a shared meal, unconditional love, are what matter most. That night, as I lay in the guest room, I heard Sophie laugh. Really laugh, the kind of pure, unrestrained sound that only children can make. And I thought about how sometimes you have to be willing to call out the people you love, to stand up and say, this isn't right. Because at the end of the day, no amount of lobster is worth more than a child's well-being. And no amount of social standing is worth sacrificing your family's happiness. I'm Grandpa William. I'm 73 years old. I worked construction for 40 years, and I'll never apologize for who I am or where I come from. And if I ever see my granddaughter being given stale bread again while others feast, I'll do exactly what I did that day. Because that's what grandfathers do. We protect our grandchildren, no matter what.